How about if I just start at the beginning? you could be honest.
Because you know what? They have the sweat equity that went into that memory that they're making with their friends and family. And that's what's important with us. And that's what the I Am Real world's about.
Well, that's a great question. You know, one of the best things about a spring food plot is you get a second chance if it fails.
Chasing Giants with Don Higgins, brought to you by buyafarm.com, your source for farm, recreational properties, rural homes, and more. By tapping into Don's years of experience, dedication, and commitment, Chasing Giants focuses on the techniques, strategies, and dedication needed to harvest one of God's most amazing creations, world-class whitetails. Now, here is Don and co-host Terry Peer.
Well, how's it going, everybody? This is Chasing Giants, episode 82 with Don Higgins, brought to you by buyafarm.com. Don, we got our second episode in a row with a special guest on the line, and he's going to be with us in just a little bit, but we had a great episode with the famous deer tracker Ron Slifer last week, and I think everybody enjoyed that, but this week's not going to take a second backseat to anything, is it?
No, for sure. Repeat guest. We don't have guests on here very often, but the one we have today is a repeat. So I think we've only had a total of 3 different people. So
yeah,
if anybody's trying to guess, they don't have many to pick from.
Right. Well, before we jump into that, you've made a trip out to Iowa, and you kind of teased us last week a little bit. What's going on with your Iowa trip?
Well, I went out there Monday, Labor Day, and took my son-in-law and business partner, Wes Delk. So it's a good thing I had them young guys along. We hung 3 tree stands, but on 2 of those, we had to go. We had to take quite a jaunt through crop fields to get to the stand sites. And I'll tell you what, this old guy was just about beat. But Corey and Wes, they did most of the work as I sit and watched. But the farm is actually shaping up. It's looking really good. I've got one camera there where I'm getting quite a few buck pictures, nothing huge. I mean, I've got one he's over 160 for sure, but the deer activity on the farm is just really picking up, and I can't wait to go hunt there this fall.
Well, that's promising as these bachelor groups start to bust up. We know that some of those deer will kind of shift range, some of them might not, but hopefully you have some new opportunities show up on camera. I did hear a little tidbit about your trip to Iowa from Wes. He actually told me that you found a tree that was perfect to hunt out of, but it just wasn't it was either crooked or something was up that you really couldn't hang a tree stand, and he actually suggested that you get a saddle and hunt out of it. So yeah, I don't know how much an Iowa tag means to you, but I know Wes suggested that to you.
Well, you know, them young guys like Wes, they come up with some pretty weird ideas, and that doesn't mean I'm going to get weird about it. So I'll put it this way. I took 3 lone wolf stands out there with me to hang, and I got all 3 of them hung right where I wanted them. So
all right, well,
I'll just leave it at that.
We're picking on Wes, but just before we picked up the phone to make this call, I was watching him on the live aim mode on a Reconic cell camera where he was making an adjustment on it in Illinois for me, so I can't pick on him too bad. He's actually on my property right now hanging a tree stand and fixing a camera for me, so I shouldn't pick on him too much. So, all right, so what's the next step for Iowa then? Now that you have the 3 sets there, are you going to just continue to monitor cell cameras, or is it going to require another trip back?
Well, right now I'm just waiting on October 1st and the first cold front. Every time I see a cold front hitting that area of Iowa, I'm headed out there. So don't know how long I'll stay. It may be 2 days, it may be 10, but every time there's a cold front, I'm headed to Iowa.
But at least at this point, you're ready for that weather to break, so you can make the trek out there. So, how many trips have you made out there now? Did you count them?
Well, that was either my 7th or 8th trip since spring. Running setting cameras, stands, knocking on doors. Just if I don't kill a giant in Iowa, it's not for lack of trying. Put that.
Absolutely. Well, we're recording this podcast a little earlier in the week, and I have it's not time for my guest, the winner of the Lester's Feet raffle, to come in town yet, so we got that upcoming, but I will throw a little bit of teaser out. I just texted you and Wes a picture of a shooter that just showed up, and I've been waiting for a shooter to get here, and 90% sure it's a deer I have a past history with, and let me say it was a nightmare. So it was the deer that I shot at that my bow blew up on last year. So I don't know if we can put a game plan. He is not on my property, but I do got a picture of him. So we're gonna try to figure out a strategy and move some cell cameras this afternoon. So I'll keep everybody posted on my social media about that. So I want to keep our stuff pretty short. Unless you have something different to talk about, why don't you go ahead and introduce our guest for today?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm excited to have Dr. Bronson Strickland back from the Mississippi State Deer Lab. Anyone who has been following our podcast may remember back on episode 31 where Dr. Strickland was on. And it's probably one of our most popular episodes. It definitely is one of our most popular episodes, and I refer back to it quite often. The thing that just blew me away about that episode is one part where I described to Dr. Strickland the management approach that I'd been taking on my own property and asked him what he thought about it, if he thought it would work or had merit. And he instantly fired back, "I believe in it so much that I wrote a book on it." So, I just took that as validation from one of the top researchers of whitetails in the world, someone I really respect. I don't read hunting magazines so much anymore. Occasionally I'll read an article, but I really like reading research papers. And Dr. Strickland and Steve Damaris there at Mississippi State Deer Lab put out some of the best. So anytime we can pick his brain, it's a good idea to do so. So without further ado, welcome to the podcast, Bronson.
Well, I am delighted to be here. And, man, I'm going to have to bring my A game. You said some really nice, flattering things. I hope I don't disappoint.
Well, I don't think you will. Your reputation precedes you. So, we're ready to start firing away and picking your deer brain and seeing what we can all learn.
Well, buddy, I'll do my best. That's all I can promise you. I'm gonna give you all I have.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna get fired up right away and just start throwing.
Imagine that.
Throwing topics.
Imagine you get fired up.
Terry will jump in from time to time and throw some things at you too, but. Where I want to start, Bronson, you and I had some back and forth by email here recently, and we talked a little bit about red deer in Europe, and specifically in regards to the Berlin Wall. And anybody that's interested, you can go online and just do a simple search for red deer Berlin Wall and look at what comes up. And basically what happened was when the Berlin Wall came down, there was red deer on both sides of that wall. But over time, those deer had learned that wall meant danger, and they did not go near it. And for decades after the Berlin Wall came down, the red deer on one side never crossed to the other, and vice versa. And even the deer, several generations removed, deer that had never been alive while that wall was there were still respecting where that wall had been. And I recently wrote an article for North American Whitetail on building an invisible fence around your property. And I've noticed something very similar to this Berlin Wall situation with the whitetails in my area. When I started working on my property years ago, if I would jump a deer on my place, it would just bust out across the wide open ag fields and run for the next timber a mile away. But today when I bump a deer on my place, I can't hardly get them to leave. They don't want to leave. And, what I've done is I've tried to make the most secure place possible for the local whitetails in my area and provide them all the food they would want, but also and especially all protection and security they'd want. And Bronson, I'm just curious in your experience, working on different properties and such, have you seen something similar where deer seem to relate to something that didn't even happen during their lifetime, but it was almost something taught to them by the previous generation?
I can't really say it's something I have seen in the field with my eyes, but I can relate to two studies that I think demonstrate this. And one would be research we're still working on, but it's related to what we call our buck movement project, and that started in 2017 and ran for a year after that. But and we put some of this out on social media recently on Facebook and Instagram and all that kind of stuff. And one thing that really intrigues me is that we have some bucks that utilize, it's almost like they have two different home ranges during different times of the year. And I'm not talking about they're just in a bachelor group. It's independent of that. It's after the bachelor group has broken up, and it may, one home range may be used in the fall and one may be used in the winter, etc. And we don't see it with all bucks. We just see it with some. And it's roughly about a third of them, about 33%, give or take, demonstrate this behavior. And Don, speaking to more precisely to your question, we noticed that these home ranges, kind of when you look from above the Google Earth view, it kind of looks like a dumbbell. And so you'll have, a big round area that's part of their home range, and then another big area, and then it's linked together. And it really appears, and you got to keep in mind the accuracy of these collars may be, 10 or 15 yards, depending on the way the satellite signals bounce off trees and so forth. But it really looks like they're using the exact same corridor going back and forth. We even just got a buck that it's one of those things that it has been a real head scratcher for us. Like, why would a buck do this? Because there's so much risk involved. We had a buck that we collared in southwest Mississippi, so on the Mississippi side of the Mississippi River, and remained there for a couple months, just doing what a buck does in the wintertime. And then he ups in literally just a couple days' time. He up and moves and swims across the Mississippi River and spends his summer in Louisiana and stayed there for several months and swam back and takes, the exact same corridor, looks like the exact same path to come back here for fall. And it's just really intriguing. Number one, why is he doing that? Is that something learned? Is that something his mother may have done? Is it some just innate behavior? We really don't know. Wish we could ask them. Another thing is a study that was done by researchers at the University of Wyoming, and they were looking at mule deer migration routes. And, none of this would have been possible 20 plus years ago without GPS collars, but it was just amazing that a lot of these deer that are going a long way, I'm talking, 50 miles or more than that. And they are literally taking the exact same path as they, navigate the mountain range. So deer certainly have this ability, and we don't know, is it something visual, a visual cue? Is it memory? Spatially, they remember where they were, where they want to be. No one really knows. But I can, relative to the Berlin Wall, I think it's very believable, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest that you can see how this would be passed on from generation to generation. And that is, you would have a mother that navigated this certain pathway, whether they were migrating or it was just a normal part of their annual cycle. But, those fawns or those offspring They learn those same paths, and it becomes kind of a inherited and evolutionary process because if you live, if you take that pathway back and forth and avoid the wall or avoid that area or whatever, and you live, then you repeat the process. You know, if you deviate from that process and live, well, you can see how the deer would start adopting a different pattern. But those that took that particular pathway, they lived, passed it on to their offspring. Those offspring passed it on to the grand offspring, et cetera, et cetera. And so they have just figured out and maintained a successful way to navigate the landscape.
That's really interesting, and it leads to another question, basically related to another article that I wrote. The title of the other article was "Same Time, Same Place," where I noted that I would see individual bucks in the exact same location on almost the exact date, multiple years in a row. When you see these whitetails, you know, moving from one range to another, is that happening at very close to the same time?
Don, I have a confession to make, and I hope over time, when I'm wrong about something, if I come back around and say I was wrong, that will further my credibility that I'm always trying to provide the best answer based on the most recent evidence and the compilation of evidence over time. If you had asked me that 10 years ago, as people did, and I should probably take the time to dig back through my email and find out who sent me an email basically saying that same thing. It was, hey, we noticed, you know, on our trail cameras within a 1 to 2 day period, you know, we'll see this buck will appear out of nowhere, and then all of a sudden it's gone. And 1 year later, or whatever the time interval, bam, we see it again, and with such regularity, you know, within a day or two. And frankly, back then, based on what we knew with the more primitive type of collars we had on deer and so forth, I didn't believe it. I was just, my thinking back then was, well, it's probably just random chance. You know, if you put a camera out there long enough, you know, sooner or later, you're going to have these instances. And we tend to create a rule, you know, around an instance. And I just didn't think there was much merit to that. But when we, and other people as well, you know, start putting these GPS collars on deer, and not all bucks do it, but Don, some of them do, with surprising regularity and timing. We've got several examples that it occurs within a week. You know, it might be the third week of February or something like that, that buck picks up and moves, changes to a different part of his home range, or moves to a completely different range entirely. And I don't have an answer for that. I don't know if it's a photo period trigger, and, you know, the changing, I don't think it would be weather, Don, because weather's so irregular. You know, the third week of February, every single year, there might be a difference of 30 degrees and snow or no snow, some type of internal clock. Why is that adaptive? Why would a deer do that? I don't have that answer. That's kind of largely what we're trying to figure out as best we can. Why is this behavior adaptive? Is it something that's buried deep within a deer or a deer herd? And we're kind of rationalizing that, you know, based on our results, we've got about a third of these bucks that are not homebodies. They are, you know, they kind of demonstrate this colonizing behavior. And if you want to go way back, you know, a deer herd and over thousands of years, maybe you just have to have some individuals within a herd that are colonizers. And that's part of a density dependent process, maybe, that the ratio of bodies to feed relative to the amount of food that's available. Some deer have got to step out there, you know, and strike out. Head west, head north, head east, whatever, and let's try to find a new place to set up shop and make a living. You know, maybe it's related to that, but gosh, I wish I knew.
Well, before I turn it over to Terry, I just want to make an observation. One of the things that I really respect about you, Bronson, is that you don't jump to conclusions until you've seen enough evidence to lead you there. And that's why I enjoy picking your brain. You're not going to, give absolutes, because there really are few, if any, absolutes with whitetails, wild whitetails anyway. And
right.
You've got to see the evidence before you're going to stick your neck out there.
And we always have to, our little sayings are, we say on the average, and that's intentional. On the average, this is what we see. And we also follow it up with never say never, never say always. Because as soon as you do, an individual deer will prove you wrong.
For sure. Terry, you want to jump in here with something?
Well, I feel like you guys are at such a level of research and land management that my question sounds stupid, but I'm going to go ahead and ask him anyway. You guys are coming from such a elite level of what the deer are doing. I want to try to relate a couple questions back to the average hunter that might be sitting in a tree stand, if that's okay, based on Don's question about this invisible fence in Berlin. Is that okay?
Oh, sure. From my perspective, yeah.
So if we're implying that it's possible for doe or deer generations after the wall came down, there was some experience or some level of communication, for lack of better terms, that those deer learned that or adapted that, whether it was just habit of the generation before them or maybe the mom saying don't go over there, for lack of better terms. My grandfather used to tell me he trained a lot of hunting dogs, and he always said that it was so much easier to train a new generation dog with his mother involved, because the mom was always obviously trained. So that period of time after a fawn is born, in episode 31 we talked about was it maternal aggression? Was that the term you used, Bronson? Where the doe basically pushes that fawn away. In that period of time, where we have a doe with her fawns out in the field, say during a hunting season, and I'm sitting out there looking, and we got all these. I set my tree stand up in a place that all these deer funnel out, and it's getting dark, and I look out, no bucks are there. Taking the approach that, that's just does out there with their fawns, I'm going to get down and blow all those deer out of the field. Basically, there is a chance that, implying what we've talked about right here, that those fawns are picking up on that and seeing that as some type of intrusion that would prohibit them later in life from basically identifying that as a safe place, whether it was by communication with the mother or whether you spook that doe. So is it still, does this help prove to the average hunter that intrusion, even for does and fawns, are just as critical for what Don's saying with pieces of his property that are such a sanctuary they feel safe there? It doesn't have to, it doesn't have to be a buck to give intrusion on a farm to make it feel unsafe. If there's this level of communication between does and fawns, that could have a long-term negative effect on your property.
Yeah, that's tough to quantify. I think there's certainly merit in that, and there may be different levels of risk that individual deer would take. But I think there's plenty of both logical and experimental support to show that doing that with regularity is going to have consequences. If you are alerting deer to your presence, if it's an event that they sense as danger, there's going to be certainly some short-term aversion for a deer to come to that place. And then potentially there's evidence that could be passed on to a fawn, and they may have a long-term aversion. Or maybe it's an aversion that they're never going to come during daylight hours or something like that. What we also, this is kind of a back and forth process, is the thing about aversion, and Don, you might relate it back to stuff you've read about food preference. There can be certain foods that deer prefer and foods that deer don't prefer until the preferred foods are eliminated. And you start seeing deer eat things they normally wouldn't eat because they're really, really hungry.
Mm-hmm.
I think you can also see that most likely behaviorally. If a deer can go to a certain part of the property where there is no history at all of risk, no adverse events ever happen there, they're probably going to be predisposed to go to that spot with more regularity. However, if that spot is not available or there's some type of social structure and you're low man or low gal on the totem pole, you might have to go to a spot that is risky, so to speak, but you're doing it not because you want to, but it's because you're hungry. Right. You know, you have to deal with that innate need. I've got to eat to live, and I'm gonna roll the dice. I'm gonna make it through. So, excellent question. Very complicated. I don't know if we could ever fully answer that, but I think there's a lot of merit to manage that way and hunt that way.
Yeah, Don, I want you to speak to that just a little bit because, you know, we get on this podcast and we talk about intrusion and access to our hunting places. And access is everything, you know, walking in the way that the wind's not blowing the wrong way or being able to get out of a position. We always correlate that back to, correct me if I'm wrong, Don, but most of the time when we're talking, whether we intend it or not, we imply it that nothing more than a mature buck's one is the lack of human intrusion. I think we miss talking a little bit about, even with this conversation, the long-term possible effects of even blowing does and fawns is probably just as important of an intrusion topic as saying we're busting out a 5-year-old, 6-year-old buck. I've seen Don be in an elevated blind before 25 minutes before dark and see the deer feeding to him, knowing that if they get all the way to him, he can't get out. So he gets out with 25 minutes left of shooting light just so he's not boogering that spot. But I just, part of me just feels that we don't do a good enough job making sure people understand, especially the average or beginner hunter, intrusion affects everything, not just the 6-year-old buck that might be bedded on your property. Don, I mean, am I off my rocker here?
No, you're absolutely spot on. And I think that's the reason I've been able to build an invisible fence, if you will, around my property, because I know for certain that a mature buck's number one desire is freedom of human intrusion. And I just take it to the extreme. I don't want any deer on my property to be bumped off because of human intrusion. You know, all my stands are located right on the edge of the property. I've got a unique property that's surrounded by ag fields, so I can, and I've got permission from my neighbors. I can come in from about any direction with the wind in my face. So the wind's always blowing away from the cover out into these open ag fields. And I'm walking in with the wind in my face, sitting right on the edge and slipping right back out and doing everything I possibly can to keep from bumping a deer. And I've done that for, 30 years now on this property. And that's why these deer stay and they don't want to leave. I'm certain of it.
Yeah.
You're right. It's every bit as important for the does as it is the bucks.
But that buck does not learn that over a 2-month period. That's from when he's probably walking around with his mom still got spots on his back. You know what I mean?
It's very possible if he was actually born on this farm, but I think a lot of times it's a yearling buck that, is relocated and dispersed from his birth area and ends up here.
Yeah.
He learns early on. I mean, it might be he shows up and he learns from the mature bucks that are already here by following them or whatever. But
my gut
it definitely starts young.
My gut just tells me that the average hunter doesn't quite get the fact of intrusion also means does. So, when you think you're hunting in a spot and it's okay to blow does out of the field because there's no buck there, I just wanted to tie that together with you two. The second question I have, Bronson, if we got a minute to talk about it. Last week we had a listener submitted question that I basically shelved part of his question and wanted to answer it on this podcast with you on it. And he implied seeing trail camera pictures with both does and bucks, but they had a bunch of flies and other insects on them. And his question was, does insects on animals add stress that could affect their health and or antler growth during the summer?
I think the definitive answer is yes, that it can, but typically it does not. And so you will certainly have some cases where a deer has an above average insect load, parasite load, ticks, etc. They're being bothered by flies. Some of that is completely normal. And again, we keep talking about not just dealing with deer right now, but over deep time, thousands of years, deer have evolved to cope with that. And so on the average, deer can cope with that. It might be a short-term stress, a short-term annoyance. There are always some individuals, and y'all see the photos every year just like me, where it'll be a trail cam photo, a deer's head is down and the back of its ear is absolutely covered in ticks. I have no doubt. And I think Steve Damaris, with his research back when he was a PhD student, he did a lot of that work and showed, there was some stress on individual deer during certain times of the year. But a couple things is I don't think it's a big enough stress that it's going to move the population average one way or the other. It's going to affect some individuals, but I don't think it's going to affect like, hey, we had more flies this year or whatever, and our average Boone and Crockett score was down 10 inches. I don't think you'd see that. And the other thing is I just really don't know what all you can do about it at any large scale with free-ranging deer. It could be tough to deal with that. So I think it's a interesting question. It's a good question. But I don't think it's affecting the herd dynamics too much. Now, what researchers have done over the years, we actually have some indicators of parasite load. And again, this is at a population scale, but you will see that when the deer density is really high, and what I mean by that is the number of deer relative to the food available, when they start getting nutritionally stressed, their bodies are not as able to cope with those parasites. And so you'll see greater parasite load often on deer that are really nutritionally stressed.
Interesting.
That's really interesting. And I'm going to throw another angle at it and get your response, Bronson, is, I've raised cattle for most of my life as well, too. And cattle is kind of my second love after whitetails. And I know that there are certain bloodlines of cattle, not breeds, but bloodlines within breeds that are more insect resistant, I guess, if you will, parasite resistant. There's certain bloodlines that you can raise all natural on grass only without ever using a chemical wormer or anything like that. And those animals seem to really thrive in that environment and under those conditions. Do you suppose it could be with whitetails that Mother Nature over time has basically selected the survival of the fittest, if you will? Those animals that were susceptible to parasites and such were eliminated from the gene pool long ago.
You took the words right out of my mouth. That's exactly what I think is going on. If you have a genotype or a bloodline or a family group and they're really, really predisposed to this, I think natural selection would have weeded them out a long time ago. And remember, natural selection is tested every year with individuals. If a fawn's born really, really early or really, really late, they're going to be most likely they're going to be selected out of the gene pool. So, yeah.
So I have a question.
I completely agree.
I have a question for both of you on that. So what are you saying is the deer that were generationally for hundreds of years raised or grew up in the swamps of Louisiana or Michigan are more tolerant to mosquitoes than a deer possibly in dry open ag ground? Is that kind of what we're saying here? That they've become accustomed to that environment and adapted, and if you tried to take one to the other, it would suffer? Am I reading into it too much, or is that what you're both saying?
I think that's kind of where we're going. That might be an extreme example. I don't know if anything is going to be impervious, to
Sure.
if you have a really high mosquito load that, they're going to be on you.
Gotcha.
I think how I would reframe that is to give you an example with EHD. Now we're not talking about insects. We're talking about a virus. We're just talking about natural selection, how their bodies cope over time. Is, in the southeastern U.S., especially right on the Gulf Coast, and on into South Texas, those deer deal with that virus all the time. And I think the most people now are more familiar with this term than they ever have been because of what's going on with COVID. And that's the term, a novel virus. That virus is not novel, to most deer in the Southeast. And so every year, I was just corresponding with our deer coordinator yesterday. We've had a few cases of EHD this year, and people are getting worried and upset and what's going to happen. And they're putting out a press release that, hey, we deal with this every year at some level. Typically, we're going to lose a couple % of deer every year. And on a really bad year, we might lose 5 to 10. But where y'all are at, in the Midwest, it's a completely different ball game because these viruses are, quote, more novel to your deer herd. And so that's where they can be really devastating and wipe out a third or a half or more of a deer herd, is then just not being familiar with that virus. So, Terry, it's kind of like that process. They're used to dealing with it, and individuals that would be really susceptible to it, they've died out a long time ago.
Interesting.
If I could build on that a little bit, I know, I had captive deer for about 25 years and got rid of those about 5 years ago. But when I was in the captive deer business, I know that they tried taking northern deer to Texas, for example, and crossing them with the Texas deer, but the northern deer just couldn't survive the EHD outbreaks down there. And even when they were crossed with the native Texas deer, they were still so susceptible to EHD, they ended up losing them all. Mm-hmm. So I think there's, a lot of merit to what you're saying there, Bronson. But if I could spin this another direction, based on my experience with the captive deer and EHD, which is a virus, and compare it to the COVID virus, when EHD is such a devastating disease for the captive deer industry that the captive deer industry has been trying for years to come up with a vaccine to address the EHD virus. And what happens, and I don't stay up with the industry, so I'm not sure what's going on today, but back when I was involved, the virus was mutating so fast that they never was able to come up with a virus or a vaccine that would work, because they would finally develop a vaccine, and that's good for this virus or this strain of EHD and this strain of EHD, but there's all these other strains that it won't cover. Yep. So, and it was very similar to what I'm seeing with COVID, because you would have to give your deer a shot, and then like 30 days later, you'd have to give it a booster shot, and everybody was still losing deer. Yeah. Are you seeing this? You're probably more familiar with the captive deer today than I am, but is this still an issue?
Yeah. It absolutely is. And hey, another human example, Don, would be every year you have to get a flu shot, and they have to formulate it every year. You're not getting the exact same flu shot you got 10 years ago. You're getting it to where they're trying to match, the most common variant that's on the landscape at the time. And it's very, very similar to EHD. One example, gosh, I think it was about 5 years ago. I'm getting old and stuff runs together. Maybe it was longer. We had a more severe outbreak in the Southeast, and I think it was really severe in the Midwest. And if I remember correctly, and I accept the blame, and forgive me if I'm wrong here, but if my memory serves, it was a new variant of the EHD virus, and I believe it was even connected to the Caribbean, and that the right wind currents, et cetera, storm, whatever, that the Culicoides midge or gnat, was able to bring that virus to the mainland, and spread that way. So
Don says it was from China. Right. Don says it was from China.
Can't say there's any evidence for that.
No, but Bronson makes a good point, because the year of our EHD outbreak, the bad EHD outbreak in the Midwest, was 2012. It's the year that we had the bad drought.
Yep.
And that same year, I went on I can remember this because I went moose hunting in Alaska that year. It was been really dry because of the worst drought I've ever seen in my life that summer. I flew to Alaska, and we hadn't mowed the yard in 2 months when I went to Alaska in early September. While I was gone, the 16 days I was gone, there was a hurricane down in the Gulf that pushed rain up our way. And my food plots just exploded in that 16 days I was gone, and my wife literally mowed the yard 3 times in 16 days, and we hadn't mowed in 2 months. And I just wonder if that hurricane hadn't blowed up that virus.
I think it's very possible.
China.
It's really hard to ever. Oh, go ahead.
I like the idea of China better.
and Don, speaking to captive deer at our research facility here, and this was way back when Harry Jacobson was here. And I think if you look at, it may have been in the Quality Whitetails book, but I've seen it numerous times. He was doing some experiments where he had native Mississippi deer, as well as some Michigan deer had been brought down. And we even had, not for us bad, because like I say, we kind of have it at some level every single year, but the Michigan deer took it really, really hard. And what was really, it wasn't cool at the time for Harry, but what's cool looking back in retrospect, the rate of mortality of the Michigan deer was directly proportional to the amount of, quote, Michigan genes that they possess. So, for example, if it was a 100% Michigan deer, then it was like almost virtually 100% of them died, 90+%. However, the offspring of a Michigan deer and a Mississippi deer, about half of those deer died, and on and on and on in that regard. So there is absolutely something to that, and how those genotypes over time are selected for to deal with things like viruses and parasites.
Very interesting.
And I'll even add one more, some stuff we're wrapping up, and gosh, I'm getting way out of my lane starting to talk about genetics. That's so complicated, and it's evolving all the time with new techniques that get better and better. But Don, we actually, in all the studies, and you got, let's go back 60, 70 years, deer for the most part were extirpated from the Southeast, meaning localized extinction. And so the Southeast, we had all of that restocking effort that took, 2 decades or more. And Mississippi alone, we had deer from North Carolina, from Kentucky, from Ohio, from Wisconsin, from Michigan, on and on, all the way to Texas and Mexico. But now with these genetic techniques, when you go back and sample all over our region, all over our state, there is little, if any at all, genetic signature from deer up north. They just more or less, they all died out over time.
Yeah, they got weeded out, natural selection.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Wow.
Well, I want to shift gears here if I can. Bronson, there's a buzzword or buzz phrase, I guess, in the hunting industry today that I'd like to get your thoughts on. And that phrase is Doe Factory. And the theory is that you don't want to provide food on your property year round. You don't want to provide it in the summer specifically, because if you provide food in the summer, your property will become home to a bunch of does and not bucks. I've kind of taken the opposite approach. I think that you want the best nutrition possible on a property 365 days a year, and if you've got does there, the bucks are coming. I've kind of, put you on the spot a little bit and already told you my opinion before I did. But I'd like your feedback on that. If you're managing a property, or are you providing the best nutrition possible year round, or do you think there's some merit to that Doe Factory idea?
I guess, yeah, I want to be respectful to whoever or group of people. I'm not sure idea that this is, and hopefully I set myself up earlier, admitted that I was wrong about something. Next time we talk, Don, I may come back and say, "Hey, man, that was a swing and a miss on my part. I'm wrong." My viewpoint, what I've seen, what I feel, is that nutrition is so critically important, and maybe I'm biased in my region. Summer nutrition, warm season, growing season, however you want to say it, nutrition is so important. And we see such big effects by correcting for that and providing, whether it's managing the habitat and ideally managing the habitat and supplementing with food plots, warm season plantings. We see such big gains when you do that. So I would never want to eliminate that opportunity out of my management toolbox. I mean, I guess we could sit here with a pencil and paper, Don, and say, okay, I'm not going to provide any growing season nutrition, but you would be you would have to assume, but my neighbor is. But I can't make that assumption on my 300 acres, 500 acres, 1,000, whatever. I'm going to make sure I have nutrition available 24/7. And most critically, as we've talked about previously, I want does, while they are gestating, while fawns are growing in the uterus, I want that mother to not be nutritionally stressed and produce fawns that are in a good condition, and maybe an epigenetic effect like we've talked about is taking place. Furthermore, I want that mother have really high quality nutrition during the lactation process. And you guys up north hear us Southern people talk about it all the time, but we don't have as much of a nutritional bottleneck as y'all do during the winter time. We still have food during the winter time. It might be of very low quality, but typically we have some food on the landscape. What is counterintuitive to a lot of people is you look at a picture of the Southeast and my gosh, it rains and it's all green and there's food everywhere. But that's not the case at all. By August and September, before fall arrives, there indeed is plenty of food on the landscape, but it's of very, very low quality. So one way to address that is to manage your habitat with tools like fire, succulent, green, herbaceous vegetation, and warm season food plots. So I'm not going to take that tool out of my toolbox. There's just too much support for having good nutrition on your property at that time of year. I've also would follow that up with, if I'm understanding the theory correctly, that you might be creating a void, so to speak, on your property from bucks because maybe does are dominating that. Gosh, when we put a GPS collar on a buck, we just don't see that. I mean, we just see buck home ranges overlap with doe home ranges.
So
Buck
there's
home ranges overlap with other buck home ranges. We just see them utilize the entire landscape.
So radio collar does not support this social environment that's created with too many does that a buck won't come into it.
I guess I haven't looked at our data with that question in mind.
Okay.
But just flipping through the Rolodex of my memory right now,
Nothing
with all the charts, graphs, maps, we don't ever see these holes in the landscape where, a buck might be thinking, well, that's a Doe Factory area. Let's stay out of there. I would say, down here when late November, December rolls around, that's probably where you're going to have a lot of bucks.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Yeah. I think it's more, I think the theory revolves more around the social aspect than the nutritional aspect. You take an area like where I'm at, if a deer is not going to find quality food on my property, there's so many ag fields around where they can find it, that they're going to get the nutrition at somewhere within their range. Mm-hmm. But the social aspect of the whole doe theory idea is that if you've got a bunch of does living on your property, the bucks are not going to be there. And if I understand you right, your radio collar research shows that not to be the case.
To me, that is inconsistent with what we see with our data, and I would even pair that with some findings of colleagues of mine in South Texas, and they were looking at different landscape now, certainly different than Mississippi. They developed, I think they developed this term called focal groups, doe focal groups, which, with deer biology, we know does follow this matriarchy. A group of does is going to be grandma and daughters and granddaughters, etc. That they will, they kind of have a shared and inclusive home ranges, that group. And what these researchers started seeing was kind of like this circuit that bucks would make on the landscape. And the best explanation based on their data was that these bucks every day or two or three were basically checking these different focal groups that, these bucks know where these groups of does are at, and they're just basically running a circuit, and they're going in and whether heat checking them, whether they're getting, really close to them, or they can do it, by 100 yards or 500 yards away. Are there any does in there that are in heat? Nope. Let's go to the next focal group, the next area. So I guess, Don, I could never say on a small property that it's always going to be tough to keep a buck on a small property 24/7.
Right.
But I guess that was very long-winded. I was just kind of working my way through it with the evidence I've seen. I can't make that reconcile in my mind. And we got also, Don, we have to separate the time of year we're talking. I mean, you're going to have some of these groups where does are going to hang out together during the growing season. That's normal deer biology. That's right. Why you have bachelor groups. They go off by themselves. They can, they don't want to be harassed. They have no testosterone. They're relatively more docile. Bucks are grooming themselves. I mean, they're not being territorial bucks at this time of year.
Right.
But buddy, when the rut comes around, all that changes.
Right.
Right.
Well, Bronson, we want to be respectful of your time, and we got some submitted questions that some of our listeners had sent in, and I'd like to read these off to you one at a time and just let you respond. I'm not even going to throw my 2 cents in, just to let you answer these listener questions, if that'd be okay.
Yeah, man, sure.
Okay, the first one comes from Ann Razor from Cincinnati, Ohio. Ann asks, can deer medicate themselves if they get sick by what they eat? If so, are there certain plants that we should be planting for deer to help them get over common illnesses, deficiencies? Thank you.
I think that deer do have that capacity, and I just say that from the perspective of there is a livestock nutrition expert that I hold in the highest regard that has shown that with livestock out west. And I would highly recommend, if you're the type of person that likes to read and learn, and it's going to be about livestock, but you can really apply it to deer. It's called Nutritional Wisdom by Fred Provenza. And it is an eye-opening book to better understand this, quote, nutritional wisdom that animals have. But Dr. Provenza talks about several times of how at least livestock animals, and we presume deer as well, can, quote, medicate themselves somewhat. I do not have any knowledge of if there's anything to plant. To help them with this, my default answer would be, I think if you manage your habitat, like we always recommend, to provide a diversity of plants, let deer select themselves. And so let's make sure the plants are available that deer evolved with. And if this process is working, then the deer can figure it out. But I don't know of anything that I never look at a management situation and say, I'm going to plant this particular forage because of something relative to, sickness.
Interesting.
But diversity.
Okay, our next question.
Hang on just a second. But diversity in there is some merit to the idea, but the key is just the diversity to not only keep the deer there, but give them the choice of what they want. I think you mentioned in our last podcast on 31 that deer were going and eating this woody browse in an area you had done research and nobody could figure it out until you did an analysis of that, and that was something that was lacking in their diet. Did I remember you saying it that way?
Yeah. What kind of the way we reconciled our findings was that people always talk about, now why do deer eat this particular plant over here? Pokeweed in the South is a real good example. Very, very, very high quality plant. But there's no doubt about it. You can talk to any deer biologist that works out on the landscape, and it'll be a real head scratcher. Why in the world are deer not eating, to any great extent, pokeweed or something on this property? And our research, which was kind of rudimentary, but it got us thinking, and our evidence supported that there are so many other chemicals that deer, secondary compounds that deer have to reconcile in their body. Any chemical can become toxic if you have too much of it. We focus all the time, crude protein, but even that, too much can become toxic. And so sometimes you will see, and again, I'm pulling from the livestock literature here, that a lot of livestock, if they have a feeding bout on a particular forage, their next feeding bout will be on a different forage because they are dealing with elevated levels of one chemical that needs to be mediated or buffered by another chemical. And so that kind of is the basis for forming why they have such a diverse diet. And so a lot of it too depends on what are the background chemicals on your property. One of ours was thinking that, sulfur can be selected against. And so if deer are eating a particular naturally occurring forage, like say in the South, a goldenrod can be higher in sulfur, they may not go and select a food plot forage that may be higher in a sulfur. And that may explain some of the property to property variation we see.
Fascinating.
But hey, that's a hypothesis.
It's just
fascinating. Needs more work and more evidence.
You could spend 2 hours just talking about that alone. What do we got for our next question?
We're just going to do one more question because we're running up on an hour here. So the next question comes from Tracy Pitts. from Laurel, Mississippi, down your way, Bronson.
All right. Yeah, it is.
He says, in regards to whitetail doe's estrus cycle, it's been said by Mr. Don and Dr. Strickland that a doe will have her cycle within a day or so for her entire life. It's well established that northern does most likely will cycle early to mid-November, where southern does will cycle as late as early January. My question is, will a northern doe transported down south acclimate and eventually get in time with the cycles of southern does? I truly appreciate all parties involved in educating the hunting public. Keep up the good work, guys. So, Bronson, if you take a northern doe and bring her south, is she going to continue to cycle as a northern doe would, or will she convert and start cycling with the southern does?
She is going to remain loyal to her genes that were adapted to her environment up north. So she is going to continue to cycle on her northern, let's just say November. She's going to continue to cycle then. Environmental conditions may buffer that a little bit. It might end up being a little bit later or something like that. But essentially, she, the way we say it is a fawn inherits conception date from her mother. And it's through the mitochondrial DNA and not the nuclear DNA. And so that is passed on. The mitochondrial DNA is passed on from mother to daughter. And we think that's kind of the mechanism that they do this. So, and there's you another example, Don, you brought up earlier about bringing those deer from up north and bringing them down south. And EHD is probably the leading cause of why that fails miserably every time they die. But long term, you're also bringing down a doe that has a conception date that this environment does not support. And one thing I'm kind of excited about this, we just wrapped up a paper, a big study, had data sets from Michigan to Pennsylvania to the Carolinas, Alabama, Louisiana, and we kind of looked at some of these concepts about predator swamping. Predator swamping meaning, why do does synchronize and why is it advantageous to drop all these fawns on the landscape at one particular time? And one of the theories has always been, predator swamping. You put too many fawns on the landscape that the predators can find and eat. And when we comb through all that data, we found a very defined relationship that works, meaning that fawns that are born several weeks before the peak, and fawns, and especially fawns that are born after the peak, they die far, far more frequently than fawns born during the peak of parturition or fawning period.
Wow.
So Don, that's just another reason. If you brought a Michigan or Wisconsin or wherever, brought her down here, you got to deal with EHD, and you're probably putting your fawns on the landscape when they're not going to survive.
That's interesting stuff.
Wow.
Yeah. Every time I talk to you, I learn something, Bronson. Well, as we close out here, you and I want to make an announcement. For the past couple of years, I've offered the whitetail master courses here on my home farm. And just to let everybody know, Bronson has agreed to come and participate in two of those classes next March. The dates for the classes next year are going to be March 10th and 12th, March 17th and 19th, and March 24th and 26th. Those will be Thursdays and Saturdays. And Bronson is going to come on the first two, March 10th and 12th. And the fee will be a little bit higher for those two, but details will be on my website soon. Bronson, you want to throw out a few things, regarding what you're going to contribute and talk about?
Yeah, you bet. I think, Don, what we figured out that I'm going to speak about is what we call our, and what you talked about earlier, that strategic harvest system. And I'm going to work through that I'll have presentation, slides, the whole deal, and it'll definitely be several hours, but we're going to work through that whole system. And we're going to begin with why culling for genetics does not work. We're gonna put that in the grave for everybody. We're going to work through that. Here's why culling for genetics does not work, and then we're going to transition into a harvesting system and management style that does work. And after that, I'm going to kind of cover the theory and teaching all of that. And then I think we're going to go out on the landscape at your place and kind of see firsthand of how you put it to practice.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And anybody that's interested, again, the evening before these classes, we have a social hour. We get together and have pizza and pop, 3 or 4 hours. You'll be able to talk with Bronson, I, and Terry one-on-one. Just kind of visit and break the ice, come back the next morning and have the class. Bronson will throw out his program for managing properties, and then I will get into the specifics of what I've done on my property, and we'll go for a tour, see stand sites and such. So anybody that's interested, March 10th and 12th are the dates for those 2 classes, and I'll be posting on social media just as soon as I get it on my website, the details. So if you follow me on social media, whether it's Instagram or Facebook, you'll see the details as soon as they come available. So as we close out, Bronson, any sneak peek at what you've got going on, any research you're currently got underway that we haven't heard about yet, or anything you want to talk about?
Well, I'm probably going to be working with our buck movement data set until I retire or die or whatever. I'm just intrigued. As soon as we think we have answered a question, it just unlocks more. So definitely more to come on that. We're wanting to kind of capitalize on what I spoke about my colleagues in South Texas were finding with these focal groups and bucks navigating the landscape. We want to do some more work in that regard of really trying to understand why they go here and don't go there, for example, and management-wise, what can we do about it? Probably the other big theme of research that's active right now is we're really looking into the timing of fire, and we just wrapped up some really good stuff comparing your typical dormant season. Down here, that would be, typically March, but dormant season prescribed fire versus growing season, and by that I mean summertime. And what are the effects in terms of managing the landscape, but as well as for deer nutrition. And so our first look at this was that both of those are really important. It's good to burn both times of year, but that growing season fire, when you get late into the summer, that vegetation that recovers. And again, it's that timing we were talking about earlier. It's really, really important. That's when fawns are being born. That's when bucks are finishing antler growth. It really adds another level of high quality nutrition, on the landscape. So we're going into that more. We're adding another layer to it now, again, from a management perspective on can we control certain tree species? Does timing of fire affect the mortality of more problematic species for us, like sweet gum and winged elm and red maple and so forth? So I could go on a little bit more, but heck, I think that's enough. That's most of what we're doing right now.
I'm going to guess you don't spend too much time watching TV.
No, not at all. I listen to podcasts and do my research and spend time with family. That's about it.
Yeah, you're like me. The TV doesn't hardly ever come on for me anyway.
Yeah,
my brain's going. Yeah, my brain's going 100 miles an hour from the time I wake up. I don't need TV to entertain me. I figured you was the same way.
That's exactly right.
Well, Bronson,
Terry, you got any comments before we close?
Well, I just wanted to, Bronson, as we close out, where is the best place for? I mean, I know we're going to be publicizing the master class and the dates that you're going to be going. As soon as we do that, I fully anticipate those classes to fill up very fast. So don't wait on that. But where else can people follow you and look at some of your research? Can you just kind of plug a little bit of the outlets that you have going right now that if people want to learn more about what you're doing, they can find it?
Absolutely. Number one is you can go online and just msudeerlab.com. Type that in, it'll pop up. That's our website. We have lots of information there. And of course, as many other people do now, we're on social media. We try to post a few things at least once or twice a week. And so we're on Facebook, MSU Deer Lab on Facebook and MSU Deer Lab on Instagram. And then finally, if you're listening to this podcast and you like this form of engagement, we also have a podcast called Deer University. And that's where either Steve and I and guests, we get together and just talk about all things deer biology and management. It's from our research to other people's research and common biology and management questions. That's what we address.
How often do you all publish an episode?
I wish we had more time. We do once a month.
Okay.
Once a month. I wish it was every other week. I wish we could do one once a week, but we just don't have a big enough staff to do that.
Yeah. Well, I feel I owe you an explanation about the China comment real quick before we close. So all of our listeners were laughing at that because Don, recently we were up at Lone Wolf, our partner for tree stands that are made in the United States. And Don got on social media and said, all that other stuff that you get from China is garbage. The only thing that China gave us was the COVID. So that was a very viral video that went out not too long ago. So I kind of left you hanging in the dark a little bit on that one. So before we closed, I wanted to clarify that. So, but outside of that, we really appreciate, I mean, the problem is just an hour doesn't even give us time to really dive into one of these topics, much less the conversations of 3 or 4. But wow, it does just spark a lot of thought for the average habitat manager that wants to improve it. So for everybody listening, please go out to those outlets on social media or the podcast platform. I'm assuming, Bronson, that you can find that on all the major platform, Apple Podcast and iHeart and everything.
Every major one that I'm aware of, it's there.
Okay. So we encourage everyone to go check that out. And as always, we thank Dr. Strickland. So I don't have anything else, Don. If you want to take us out or make some comments, that's fine.
I just want to thank Bronson once again for not only participating in our podcast, but for agreeing to come to the master class in March for 2 dates. He brings a lot of credibility. I've got a ton of respect for him. I would much rather read something that he's put out than a hunting magazine. I just encourage everyone to do a internet search for Bronson Strickland, and you'll be shocked at what you're going to learn.
All right.
Well, hey guys, I appreciate it, man. Don, you're making me feel bad here. You're being too kind.
I'm just being honest.
I think
an hour is never enough, but we can always do it again. So
I got a different idea, Don. I think after this master class and goes, I think Bronson maybe next season needs to make a little time to come up and hunt with us late October or in November sometime and hunt one of our 2 farms with us one day. I think he needs
That'd be fantastic.
I think he needs to make some time for that. What do you say?
Now you're talking.
All right. Well, Don, why don't you take us out with our sponsors?
All right. We want to thank our sponsors, BuyAFarm.com, Victory Chevrolet, 360 Hunting Blinds, Real World Wildlife Products, Matthews Archery, Lone Wolf Tree Stands, WildlifeFarming.com, Quiet Cat, Vortex Optics, and Vengeance Camo. Hope you enjoyed it, everyone.